Greetings. Welcome to the latest event in the Business Matters webinar series from Gies College of Business. I'm Amanda Brantner, Senior Associate Director in Gies Online here at the University of Illinois Gies College of Business. I look forward to spending this next hour with you. Our faculty experts have developed this series of webinars to address some of the most pressing issues businesses face today, from the economic impact of COVID-19 to cybersecurity and ethics. These webinars enable you to be better prepared to succeed and thrive through any number of challenges. Before we get started with Cyberrisk Triad, technology, security, and insurance, I just want to cover one quick housekeeping item related to the Q&A portion. We'll ask that you submit all of your questions via the Zoom Q&A feature, and I'll bring those questions to our presenters near the end of the session. Now for a bit about our presenters. Lynn McChristian is a senior instructor and director of the Office of Risk Management and Insurance Research here at Gies College of Business. Lynn's corporate career includes more than 14 years working in the Florida office of USAA, and she has also been a consultant with the Insurance Information Institute and the American Property Casualty Insurance Association. Next, we have John Donald. John is a cyber advisor at Access Capital. Before joining Access Capital in 2019, John's career included 20 years in investment banking, during which he won the Institutional Investor Award for #1 ranking in Asian equity research for 5 consecutive years, ownership of a Scotch whiskey company, which he successfully sold to investors in 2008, and 10 years running his own risk consultancy, where he advised on geopolitical and cyber risk. Finally, we have Renwan Fung. Renwan is a professor of mathematics, statistics, and industrial and enterprise systems engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Renwan consults for many organizations. He provides expert testimony to law firms for public policy assessment and actuarial analysis. He researches the mathematics and economics of risk and uncertainty in the financial world. And he has also published extensively in top-tier actuarial and quantitative finance journals. Renwan also co-founded the Illinois Risk Lab. I ask you to join me in welcoming our presenters. What an esteemed group of individuals we have with us today. I look forward to turning it over to Lynn to kick things off.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Amanda. Let me bring up my screen here. And I do want to thank you. What we're talking about today is cyber risk from 3 perspectives. And we're going to talk about those 3 perspectives because they're strongly intertwined. So we're going to be discussing cybersecurity, cyber risk modeling and how that's adapting and improving. And we're starting with insurance, because insurance should be the first thing people think about. And it's a forethought, not an afterthought, in building up your defenses. I want to highlight the importance of insurance as part of that proactive strategy. And it's not only about recovery. Cyber insurance includes a risk assessment component, and that's becoming ever more important as we move forward. So having that important element as a part of your cybersecurity protocol is very, very important. Are you all seeing this slideshow as full screen? Okay, I wanted to make sure that you were. So anyway, what we're looking at is insurance is a dynamic product, okay? And the way that it works is it reflects what's happening in the environment, and that's for any line of insurance. Everybody knows that cyber incidents are growing. Data breaches happen every single day. We only hear about the big ones. And what it is that right now, proper insurance is not a standalone defense. It requires adequate security and protocols and personnel in advance, continuous monitoring, and the use of scenario planning. It's not enough just to have the insurance. What are you going to do if there is a breach? How you'll respond is an important part of the conversation to have within an organization. insurance is not a substitute for that. And insurers are partners in the process. They are working to help the organization improve its cyber defense and to build on that structure. And there's an obvious sense of urgency because cyber crooks are quite innovative. When we figure out one vulnerability and plug it, they figure out a way to get into our best defenses. There have been some high-profile ransomware attacks, and that's reflected the need to make sure you have good insurance in the first place. So the crooks are well positioned. They seem to be one step ahead, and the little decisions that individuals make in an organization seem to have infinite importance. And we'll talk a little bit more of that as we go along. We want to make sure everyone's aware of the cyber risk, but awareness must translate into action. So we're pushing information out to our staff, we're pushing information out to our troops, but do we really have an understanding of the level of cybersecurity awareness? It's about resources and controls, and that's just a few. In a connected world, we're aware of the risks, but maybe not doing enough to translate that into action. So I share with you this chart right here. And to look at this trajectory is going to give you a little bit of a snapshot. So from 2000 to the year 2007, that was when the first million complaints about internet crime were recorded. 7 years for the first million. And the most recent million happened in just 14 months. Part of this is due to the fact that people now know how to report and where to report the incidents. So that shows you the awareness, but we're still looking at what are the actions that need to happen, what needs to take place. And so the next slide here will show you that while the number of data breaches are declining against individuals, they're increasing against businesses. Individual data is not the likely target anymore. It's really businesses. The so-called little guy is not the target, but neither are the bigger companies. A bigger company which may have a robust IT department and have the funds and the resources to build up that defense is going to be less vulnerable, require more work for a cyber criminal for that attack than a mid-sized business which may not have all the systems in place. And that's where we're seeing the trend go now. The targets, the individuals have decreased, but the targets are more medium-sized and they're going after a bigger amount of funds. So the complaint statistics I want to look at too is where the vulnerability lies. And when you look at it in our connected world, it's all the tools that we use on a day-to-day basis. So you have the phishing is using the email to lure people in. Vishing is voice for your phone system. The smishing is text, SMS. And then the farming is sending you to a website that you didn't intend to go to and getting information from you that way. So all the tools we use for our daily lives and our way that we work are where the statistics are coming in and where we're seeing the most incidents of cyber threats. And so ransomware, we all know that's making the news. And you know, the businesses that are being targeted are typically those that have a cyber insurance policy. The crooks know who has those policies. And there's been debate about why is the ransomware being paid? Why is the ransom being paid? Some companies will say it's cheaper to pay that ransom than it is to have a delay. But this may be changing. So as that debate goes on, this ransomware picture may change. If the protocols are strengthened, so there's a backup, then that would make that less likely to be paid. But the amounts of the payouts are getting news. They're getting more costly to pay those things. But the balance is suffering a significant downtime. What is that worth to you? Many insurance companies partner with cybersecurity firms to help companies do a proper risk assessment. And that's the missing piece, is making sure you assess your vulnerabilities ahead of time is very important. Better defenses will lead to lower insurance costs. Who is most likely to be victimized? And this chart shows you that the top 3 targets are healthcare, financial services, and then manufacturing and utilities. Everyone seems to be vulnerable to some degree, but these are the industries and the organizations where the greatest vulnerability has been experienced, and it's growing. And insurance industry looks at these type of categories because really insurance has to look at the industry someone's in and the business that they do and what's at risk, okay? And all insurance is the cost of claims. That's what every line of business is. If the cost of claims rises, then the cost of insurance must rise. What insurance is, it has to have the money in advance to pay anticipated claims. And as this trend continues, the cost of that premium is going to go up. Additionally, the desire to do a better risk assessment and to help their policyholders analyze, control, and plan for their vulnerabilities is something that the insurance industry is partnering with to keep these trends in check. Okay. Whoops. So to transition to our next speaker, I'll talk you a little bit about what's happening in the cyber industry market. More businesses are seeking coverage. And as that price is increasing, it's because of the more frequent types of cyber threats that we are seeing. But insurers are doing different things to manage that cost. They are tightening up some of the policy languages. They may be adopting coverage limits, but they're also looking for ways to help a policyholder on the front end. That risk assessment portion is very, very important. Insurers want their policyholders to put more controls in place so that they can reduce the vulnerabilities at the outset, and that'll lower that cost of insurance. And I want to stress that the service insurance companies provide is to prevent their policyholders from becoming cyber victims in the first place. The price that you pay for insurance sends you a signal about that vulnerability. And if you consider the categories where the risks are appearing, that's telling you where action is taking place right now in the marketplace. And our next speaker, John Donald of Access Capital, he'll share his expertise on how to pay heed and to reduce those risks at the outset. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lynn. I'm going to share my screen now. So do you see my screen okay?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. So I want to start off looking in a more holistic way, maybe, about the different types of risks out there. This is a chart that comes from Davos, the World Economic Forum of 2 years ago, where all the attendees were asked to rank the threats facing the global economy according to 2 criteria: the likelihood of it happening and the impact that it would have. So you can see, this is from 2 years ago, that in the top left-hand corner there, WMDs, if a nuclear bomb was to go off, it would clearly be high impact, but they thought that would be low likelihood. That's why it's up in the top left-hand corner. What was it that they were most concerned about? Well, let's look over there in the top right. You can see it's basically climate change and cyber attacks. Now, remember, this is from 2 years ago, so you can see plague there right in the middle. I think if they were to redraw this diagram now, that would probably have moved up to the top right as well. But focusing just on those 2 things, climate change and cyber attacks, when we translate that into insurance speak, climate change is all about property insurance, because tornadoes and fires damaged property or earthquakes. And cyber is the second thing, which they thought, you can see up here, were the things which are most concerning and the biggest threats to the global economy. But the key point to make is they're two very different types of risks. Because when it comes to natural catastrophes like earthquakes, bushfires, tornadoes, and the like, you're purely working in the physical realm. A tornado is a physical object, a building is a physical object. When they interact with each other, you can perform some sort of mathematical calculations to try and figure out what the impact might be. But as soon as you move into other realms, if you move up one level into biology, you're including some sort of Darwinian evolution into the equation. And if you move right to the very top, cyber threat is actually a fourth order complex problem, because not only is it in the realm of biology, because you're dealing with human beings, it's also, you also have a degree of anticipatory intelligence. So you don't just have a feedback loop through natural selection, you have a feed forward loop as well, because the attackers and defenders are trying to outthink each other even before they've made their move. And that makes cyber risk very different from other types of risk, because it's fourth order complex rather than first order complex. And of course, the other point is the point that Lynn made about the connectivity. The likelihood of 3 buildings collapsing in New York, London, and Tokyo all at the same time is 0. The likelihood of 3 computers going down in New York, London, and Tokyo at the same time is certainly not 0, because they're all connected, which was Lynn's point. And that's, of course, the whole point of the internet. Now, I want to go to, I think some of you may have read in the news that Donald Rumsfeld sadly died last week. And he's best known for this speech that he made back in 2002, where he was talking about the known knowns and the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And it was so confusing. I won't read out the whole thing there, but it was so confusing that he won the Foot in Mouth Award from the assembled journalists, because no one could quite understand what it was that he was talking about. And the reason why it's so confusing is that he's using the word known to mean 2 different things. Known, we are aware that it exists, and known that we can predict it in some way, that we can quantify it in some way. And as soon as you separate out those 2 meanings, what he was trying to get to suddenly becomes much more clear. And I've laid them out here, and you can see in these 4 quadrants. So we have things which we are aware of and that we can quantify. That would be the known knowns. We have things that we are aware of, but we can't quantify. That would be the known unknowns, and so on. Now, when you think about cyber risk, if you go back maybe 10 years ago, we were definitely in the realm of the unknown unknowns. We were unaware of the degree of the risk, and of course, we couldn't quantify it. And the journey of cyber risk has been a gradual anti-clockwise movement through these different quadrants, so that we're now approaching, maybe 5 years ago, we moved into quadrant 2. We were aware of the risk, but it was very hard to quantify. But as Runhuan is going to show you later, we're now moving, because we're getting better data all of the time, towards the known known, that we are aware of the risk and we can quantify the risk, as Runhuan's going to be showing you later when we get to his model section. But I want to take it in this direction. If you think, what is the definition of security? Security is the degree to which your assets are resistant to threats from adversaries. Now, we can take all of these terms and map them onto those quadrants, and we end up with something a bit like this. So the adversaries are the unknown unknowns. We don't know who it is who's trying to attack us. They're hidden behind so many layers of VPNs and other things that we will never truly know their identity. So they are the unknown unknowns. And I want to basically spend the rest of my part of the presentation just stepping through these 4 quadrants to talk about adversaries, threats, assets, and then finally the impact. Let's start with the adversary side. As I said, these are the unknown unknowns. We don't know who's trying to attack us, but there is one thing that all attacks have in common, and that is basically the human element, that maybe 95% of all attacks which happen, which are successful, have some degree of human error. And this is a very famous cartoon, which basically says you might have the most sophisticated defenses in the world, but up against the stupidity of the user, in this case characterized as Dave sitting there in the corner, the point of this cartoon is that you don't stand a chance, because there's always going to be some element of human error. For me, I think that's oversimplistic, And I want to introduce two ideas from economics just to dig into this a little bit deeper. And the first one is to refer you back to the Laffer curve concept. This was basically at the heart of Reaganomics back in the 1980s. And the observation that Mr. Laffer made was that there is a maximal amount of tax that you can extract from the populace. So if you look in the bottom left here, let's assume the tax rate shown here by the purple line is gradually increasing, let's say from 20% to 30% to 40%. The problem is that the number of people who actually pay tax is then declining, because it's actually worth either trying to avoid tax or putting stuff into trust funds or doing some sort of tax avoidance activity. So the tax rate may be going up, but the number of people actually paying tax goes down. And that means that you have a maximal point. Up there you can see with that orange triangle. At that maximal point, you may be increasing your tax rate, but you're reducing your tax take. You're reducing the amount of tax you're collecting, even though you're putting the tax rate up. And that's, of course, the maximal tax point. Now, we can read across from this tax discussion to cybersecurity. So when it comes to security controls, you may be putting in place stricter and stricter security controls, but the number of compliant users will decline. As if you're trying to capture people in a tighter and tighter straitjacket, the amount of time they'll invest in trying to circumvent that or find some other way of actually achieving what they're trying to do will actually increase. So in the same way, you have a maximal point of security that after a certain point, you may be increasing your security controls, but actually reducing your resilience because less people are following it because there are less compliant users. So that's basically the first point. So we all know that security you can never have 100% security because you only have to have one attacker getting through. And you have to try and defend against all of them all of the time. So you can never have 100% security, but this would suggest maybe you can only get to maybe 60% security. And what do you then need to do for the other 40%? Well, there are other things which you can do. There's other things which the organization can do to try to improve your security, not depending on your IT security controls, but also, and this is Lynn's point, this is where the insurance part comes in, because if security takes you so far, then it's complemented by the insurance policy, which will take you to fill in the other 40%. But as I said, there are things that it's not just an IT security problem when it comes to cyber risk. And this is where I want to introduce the second concept from economics, which is known as the tragedy of the commons, the tragedy of the commons. And this comes from medieval times when villagers were allowed to graze their cattle on the common ground, on the village green in the center of the village. And after a time, all the grass disappeared. And the reason for that is that the benefits of grazing your cow on that grass were purely to the individual, but the costs were shared to the group as a whole. If there was very little grass left there, I would still put my cow there because all the benefits come to me, but the costs are shared by the group. Now, there are plenty of examples of tragedy of the common situations. The overfishing in the oceans is a tragedy of the commons, that you can go out there and still be trying to catch fish. The benefit is to you, the cost is to everyone else. Pollution is another example of tragedy of the commons. But if you think about it, cyber security is also a tragedy of the common situation. Because if I'm circumventing some of those security controls, the benefit is to me. It makes my job easier. I can get to do what I want to do. I can ignore the password warnings. I can use a simple password just because it's quicker and easier for me. But the cost is shared to the group as a whole. So the real problem with cybersecurity is, how do you escape from a tragedy of the commons? And the answer is you can either have a stick strategy or a carrot strategy. Now, the stick strategy is one where you have a cost to the individual, but a benefit to the group. You must do this or else. And a lot of security thinking in the past has all been of the stick type, but people are now beginning to realize that a carrot strategy works much better. So a carrot strategy would be, please do this online training and we will give you this reward. There needs to be a benefit to the individual and a benefit to the group. Please do this certain thing and you might get an extra day's holiday. If there's some sort of reward and a carrot strategy, then your security strategies are much more likely to work. So that was a little bit there about the adversaries. Let's focus now on the threats. One of the points that Lynn was also making earlier on is that we're shifting away from a concern about data breaches, a data being stolen and maybe sold on the dark web, towards ransomware. And the reason behind this shift is best explained by thinking about it from the perspective of the criminal. So if you have a certain set of cyber skills, the question to you is how best to monetize those skills. And one of the things which happened when there was a lot of data exfiltration, by that we mean people stealing credit card numbers or other personal details, is that so much data was being dumped on the dark web for sale that prices collapsed. And at the same time, cyber defenses were increasing. So the rewards you were getting by grabbing, stealing data and trying to sell it basically declined dramatically, which is why there's a shift over to extortion and ransomware, because it's a much better way of trying to monetize whatever skills you have. And the example I like to use for this, I call Eric Clapton's magic glove. So I want you to imagine that Eric Clapton has managed to invent a magic glove that he's selling in your local music shop. And if you put that glove on your hand, you can suddenly play the guitar as well as Eric Clapton can. You could become a rock god overnight by just buying this glove and putting it on your hand. Now, of course, that doesn't exist in the real world, but it does exist in cyberspace, because we now have the situation of ransomware as a service. That is, someone, the finest criminal hackers out there create some sort of ransomware tool, and then you can go online and buy that and use all of the skills which are packaged in that tool, even if you're not skilled yourself. So Eric Clapton's magic glove doesn't exist in the music world, but it certainly does exist in the cyber world. And this is a serious problem, because in the past, when you're thinking about a risk evaluation, you would be focusing on intent and capability. The idea is that some people wish you ill, but they don't have the capability to do it. And there are people who have the capability, but they don't wish you ill. So it's only the people who have both the intent and the capability who are the ones you should worry about. Now, the trouble with ransomware as a service is that it means anyone who has the intent also has the capability, because you can go and buy those tools online. Let's focus a little bit now on the assets which we need to focus on. The way which we analyze these inside Axis is using something called the Parkerian hexad. So it's a hexad, it's got six faces. And you can see here, the blue ring on the inside are the security attributes of the assets that you're trying to protect. So it's like the traditional confidentiality, availability, integrity model, but expanded a little bit to have 6 factors rather than just 3. And around the outside, if the blue thing says those are the attributes you're trying to protect, the green ring around the outside shows the control methods that you would put in place from a cybersecurity standpoint in order to protect those security attributes of your assets. And the point to make, and this comes back again to what Lynn was talking about earlier, is that when you look at the way that cyber policies are written, the coverages fit on top of that hexad like a hand in a glove. So that if you look, there's a clear link between what cybersecurity is trying to do in terms of the green ring and what the coverages in a typical cyber policy do, which is in the blue ring, because the two of them fit on top of each other. And the point is, as I was saying earlier with the Laffer curve, that if security only gets you 60% of the way there, then insurance gives you the other 40%. But of course, the most important thing, remember when we go back to Donald Rumsfeld, that he only said 3 things in his analysis. He said there were known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. These 3 different things here. Of course, the one he didn't point out was the one that actually cost him his job in the end, the unknown knowns, the things that you don't know, but you should know. So we may not know who the adversaries are who are trying to attack us. We know something about the threats, but it's difficult to quantify them. With the assets, well, of course, we're aware of the assets we're trying to protect, and Renhuan's going to be talking about that in a bit more detail later. In fact, he's going to be talking about all three of these factors. But the most important thing, the one thing that you should know, is how would a cyber incident affect me? Because that is quantifiable, and you may be unaware of how much damage it might actually cause. And so the whole point of Renhuan's model, which is coming up in a minute, is to basically help you understand what that impact would be, and the best way for you to basically be playing your cards in your hand. I have an extremely simple model here, just to start the topic off, which is basically to say, if you've no idea to start off with what the impact might be, then with just three simple things, you can at least have a first stab. And that would be some sort of model based around revenue, headcount, and customers. Because if you think of the costs of a cyber incident, some of them are going to be fixed, like the forensics that you would need to pay for on some sort of fixed day rate. But typically speaking, the size of the impact is going to be linked to, number one, your revenue, because of course you're going to have business interruption, which would be lost revenue. Number two, to the restitution cost of putting your system back. And that of course is going to be some sort of function of the number of PCs you've got. And that of course is a function of your headcount. And lastly, if you have regulatory fines or notification costs or credit monitoring which needs to be done, that's a function of your customer records. And that of course is a function of the number of your customers. So a very, very simplistic model would be to say, what's your revenue? How many employees have you got? And how many customers have you got? And you should be able to work it out. But that's far too simple. And now I want to hand over to Renhuan, who's going to explain in much more detail how to do it properly. Over to you, Renhuan.
Thank you, John. Okay, so Lee and John have done a great job laying out sort of the foundation of the analysis. And I will be talking about the specific models that can be used to assess cyber risk and use that for capital management. So this is really a summary of what John has talked about, John and Lee both talked about earlier. There are several difficulties with cyber risk assessment. Number one is what John mentioned earlier, that data scarcity. Cyber attacks happen every day, but not all of them are reported, and there is no essential repository of cyber incident, at least not in the United States. So it's very difficult to gather all the data or sufficient data for assessment. Secondly, is what the cyber risk is adaptive and fast changing, and this is what John mentioned earlier as the fourth order of complexity. Because the adversaries are constantly developing new strategies, new attack strategies to overcome, bypass existing defense mechanisms. So you'll be facing with different types of different nature of the risks evolving over time. And thirdly, cyber attacks, cyber losses are highly dependent, because attack in a particular one corner of the world can attack many parts of the rest of the world, like the vulnercrime ransomware attack in 2017. It actually affected many countries in the world. So they're not geographically bounded, which causes a challenge in your modeling. The last but not the least, a large portion of cyber losses in certain categories are costs of legal defenses and settlement. And these are determined by the legal system, which could be harder to predict as well. So when we started this research, we realized that there seems to be a gap between the engineering literature and the insurance actuarial literature, right? So on the engineering side, the engineers tend to focus on the microstructure of cybersecurity system. They look at attack graph and how attack would penetrate a computer system, and how it attacks different nodes of the computer network. And if you model at this very granular level, it's very difficult to do that, to scale it up for a large number of companies. And there's also a well-established cybersecurity framework by different agencies, national agencies, international organizations, and that are not really used in the insurance industry. I'll give you an example of that later on. But one shortcoming of this detailed cybersecurity analysis is that it lacks insight into the priorities of control tasks, right? There are some vulnerabilities that are maybe rare to be attacked, rarely attacked. Even if you have all the resources in the world, you may not be able to eliminate all the vulnerabilities. So there's the, for decision makers, there's also the issue that how do you balance the need to increase your cybersecurity, at the same time be prepared for inevitable cyber losses. If you look at the actuarial literature, they're using, I think in the industry, they typically use the classical frequency severity analysis, which is actually common to other types of property and casualty risks. And they're not that's necessarily very unique to cyber risk, right? And then if you look at academic literature, they use very abstract models such as a Vine, copular, and other high dimensional dependent structure, which can be difficult to use in practice. So we wanted to develop something that takes into account the cybersecurity structure developed in the engineering, but also would allow insurers to assess cyber risk and do pricing and reserving for insurance products. So in this framework, so in this is an early stage of research. We're looking at how do you balance needs between two components of your cyber risk management, right? On one side, there's the cybersecurity investment, right? How do you increase the protection level? And the other hand, how do you set up funds aside, right, the capital aside to absorb potential losses? And this is particularly focused on self-insurance, and just
essentially this is an application to the Cyberrisk framework as well. So we're using this cascade model, which is developed in the engineering literature. So each cyber attack is viewed as an sort of this chain reaction, right? You start with a threat, which is a potential cause of cyber incident. For example, someone could try to explore, try to attack your protected document and try to guess your password, right? The vulnerability is a weakness in your system that a threat can exploit, right? Such as a weak password, right? Okay. Okay, so the asset, for example, would be a password protected document, and a control national that can be implemented to eliminate or reduce the cyber risk. For example, if you enforce a very strong password, then that could reduce the risk. Okay, so here's an example of how this is actually implemented in cybersecurity framework, right? So this is based on the CIS control framework. And this is a mapping between threat, different types of threats, and the CIS controls. And And so here, each control really corresponds to a particular vulnerability. So this next slide will show you the mapping between controls and assets. Okay, and then entry of one means there is a path going from control to from the vulnerability to an asset. If it's empty, that means it is not possible, right, to attack the particular vulnerability and have an impact on the other assets. So if we build the structure into the model, right, then for example, there's an example that I have 3 different threats, and one of them is a ransomware attack, and that could hit the 2 vulnerabilities, software vulnerability and the employee's lack of security awareness. And then the company can enforce a risk management policy, a cybersecurity policy, so that to get employees trained for cybersecurity, that would eliminate this this path. So going from T3 to V3 to A1, that's a mitigated path, right? But if you let the threat to explore V2 and make an impact on A1, if you don't take any action on A2, that's an unmitigated path, right? So we want to be able to model all this in the model, okay? And once you patch the vulnerability, there are different degrees of measure, right? So then you could define that by this parameter here. 1 means it's fully patched. Less than 1, this ratio means it's partially patched, and that would reduce the impact of your attack. So if you use this, so this is essentially a tensor structure if I borrow a mathematical language. And so for each threat vulnerability asset pair, we can use industry model to understand its risk profile, loss distribution, and then we can apply these control measures to understand the company's control measures, and then map that onto this tensor. Then you'd have a company-specific risk profile, which is modeled in this tensor, right? And once we get that, and then you can aggregate the losses at the corporate level, right? First, you can compress. So this cubic, the cube here essentially represents that tensor, and each element in this tensor is a threat vulnerability asset tuple. And then if you so first we can look at the potential losses on each threat threat asset pair, right? So if you compress this tensor in this J direction, right? And then you do that because in some policies you can actually you make insurance coverage, you offer coverage for each threat asset pairs. I'll show you an example a bit later. And then if you continue to compress it on the K direction, then you can get the losses for each potential losses for each incident, right? Which could mean impact from different types of assets. Okay, and then if you put them together, I compress it again, then you'd get the aggregate losses for each period from all types of incidents, right? And then here you can use a rival process stochastic process to model the frequency of the arrival of the attacks. Okay, here's an example. I essentially took a snapshot of a particular part of a cyber policy, right? For example, Cyber 1, that it specifies a threat, right? A computer attack, and it also specifies the asset that's under attack, right? that suffers loss, right? So then there's 3 different types of assets, right? They offer different coverage for them, and then that's why we need to be able to model the losses at this granularity. Okay, once you know that, so in this model, we did not specifically look at the insurance policy, but this application can be extended to analyze the insurance policy as well. So in this model, we're looking at cybersecurity and reserve. Okay, and this is the Laffer curve John mentioned earlier. Right? If you invest very little on cybersecurity, then you have to have lots of capital to absorb potential losses later on. If you invest heavily on cybersecurity, you probably don't cover very much. You won't have much loss, cyber attacks, but then you would spend a lot of money, right? Which would maybe reduce the sort of investment from for other purposes. So here's an example. So we're using this advising data, and that's all the cyber losses from 1997 to 2007 in the United States. And so in the advising data, they have essentially 4 categories of threats: data breach, privacy violation, extortion, fraud, and ID error. So here we're using, in this example, we only consider 2 that mostly commonly observed threats, data breach and privacy violation. And we take 3 out of the 4 vulnerabilities identified in the database. So communication system, data storage, and software. And then we look at 2 types of assets: the personal financial information and personal identifiable information. As you can tell, here is the Cascade model. I want you to bring your attention. So the asset number 1, asset 1 would only be attacked, right, by a threat number 1, but then it has to go through the vulnerability 3. So as you can see, if I can patch V3, then there is no chance that the asset 1, personal financial information, will be attacked, right? So then we look at the data, and then we use some heavy tail distribution, Weibo distribution in this case, to model the losses from each threat vulnerability in the asset triple. We used historical data on different categories of threats to understand its probability, and we use the Poisson distribution to model the number of incidents in each year. So this graph is to show you we do a good job at modeling the cyber losses. You can tell that the late tail are visually, you can tell it's actually very good fit to that. So here's the result. So there are 3 types of vulnerabilities, right? And then we use, if you spend this much money, this is a hypothetical assumption, then that would be fully patched. So these numbers are actually based on historical quantile of losses from these vulnerabilities. And then so because there are 2 threats, 3 vulnerability, and 2 assets, right? So a total of 8 combinations, right? And then if you what we did is to run a optimization strategy to minimize the cost of cybersecurity investment, and also the mismatch, the shortage in your capital from cyber attacks with a given level of reserve. So we're trying to balance this to minimizing the total cost. Then you can, so this quantity, the first column shows you the quantitative measure of the cyber investment versus losses, right? So they wanted to be as small as possible, and you can see here the third strategy, right, is actually the winning one. So that means you would fully patch the first and third vulnerability, okay, but then leave out the second vulnerability. That means that you don't invest in this, but you prepare it to cover some small losses later on. And then you set up a self-reserve of this much to absorb potential losses down the road. And this will tell you that sort of the optimal strategy. And you can tell from this that if V3, right, because V3 is the only vulnerability that allows any threat to attack asset 1. So if you invest in V3, so that the M3 here, then they would eliminate chance of having an attack on anyone. So that's why this column is all 0. Okay, so some key takeaways. Number one, we just want to point out that there's a gap between the insurance and engineering literature. The insurers have not really, at least to my knowledge, have not extensively used the Cyberrisk cybersecurity framework to model losses. So we hope in this research provide a framework to offer a holistic approach to analyze the balance between these two. And I noticed that in one of the audience questions that they asked, whether a carrot or stick, which strategy is better. In fact, you can actually quantify that, use the same framework to model, which would produce the best outcome with the minimal cost. And then I want to point out that in this model, you can take advantage of the industry data to understand the losses, but then you can also take into account the company's unique cybersecurity profile using the tensor structure that we mentioned earlier. And then at the end, I want to point out, so you can, this concept can be further extended to include the cost benefits of different types of risk management strategies as well. So that ends my talk. I will pass this back to Amanda and Lynn.
Thank you, Renwan, John, Lynn, for those thoughtful comments. Really great to hear from the three of you today. We have a few questions. We'll spend the last 5 or so minutes here answering a few questions from the audience. If there are any audience members who have additional questions or like a question that's been posed in the Q&A, I invite you to share that feedback and those questions there. So John, this speaks to one of the items that you talked about, the quote from Donald Rumsfeld. And the question is from Elvira. She asks, can you make unknown knowns known knowns? In other words, switching what you defined as impact into assets. I think you covered that a little bit at the end of your remarks, yes, but maybe you could elaborate a bit.
Yes, of course you can. And of course you should. And the whole point of trying to figure out what the impact would be to do exactly that. So to convert your unknown known into a known known, the thing that you don't know but you should know, into something that you do know, that's why you have to basically try and figure out what would be the impact on your organization. So you could either use my incredibly simplistic 3-dimensional, revenues, customers and headcount, or you do it properly by using Renwan's model. But I mean, the whole point of the exercise, I guess, is to urge people, if you haven't thought, what would the impact be on your organization, to convert that unknown known into a known known by doing the sums yourself.
Excuse me. Thank you, John. Great explanation. I think one of the really exciting pieces of this webinar is really that intersection of your explanation and then diving really deeply into Renwan's very detailed. In fact, one of the participants commented, wow, you're losing me. This is really deep, Renwan. Obviously, from a mathematician and scientific perspective, you have a really deep knowledge here, but understanding that at the top level, John, that you really explained and tried to bring down to earth a little bit, and then thinking about Renwan's really mathematical and scientific approach as well is really amazing. So thank you both for sharing those perspectives. Moving on to the next question from Naveen. Naveen asks about states first that cybersecurity budgets are not infinite. When thinking about cybersecurity, how can an organization prioritize spending between cybersecurity infrastructure and end user training? Any thoughts from the three of you on that question?
I could maybe just go quickly, and I'm sure Renwan wants to take it up in more detail, but typically speaking, actually one of the most effective things you can do is, if you have proper incident response planning and also staff training, you can probably reduce the cost of a breach by about 30%, according to the last IBM cost of a data breach study, which came out in 2020, something like that as a rough rule of thumb. And the second thing to point out is that the size of the two markets are hugely different. So at the moment, the value of the cyber defense market is about 120 billion, and the size of the insurance market is only 7 billion. Now, if you look across at other lines of insurance, like property, the amount spent on protection and the amount spent on insurance are roughly 50-50. But in cyber, it's 120 versus 7, which would imply maybe people are spending too much on defenses and not enough on insurance. But of course, the real answer will come from Renjuan, because that's what his model is all about.
Thank you. I think John answered it very well. I don't think I have a definite answer to this question, but that's what actually the model is built for. If we can take into account the cost of cybersecurity infrastructure, and also the cost of user training, and then its impact, how it's going to mitigate the cyber risk, and then you can put all these inputs into the model, and then hopefully the model would actually be able to give you a objective a solution from this optimization problem.
I might add, Amanda, it's not just it's not just the insurance, it's not just the resources you have, but what are the controls that a company has into place, and those controls have to change to keep up. So it's just like these are moving targets. So a company needs to look at the resources. Is it sufficient for the type of business they run? Do they have proper controls in place? Do they even have a risk governance policy that's overarching for the whole organization? You can start there to describe what you would do and how you're going to present the issues and build up those defenses. And then, what is the detection method that you have? Is that sufficient? And to go back to what something that both John and Renjuan mentioned, is the incident management is important. When something happens, what are you going to do? And most companies don't think that through. And knowing how you'd respond is a good exercise to go through. And it just keeps that cycle of that enterprise risk management framework working for the organization and keeping up with these new risks that keep appearing for us.
Thank you all for those thoughts on that question. I know a couple of individuals have asked in the chat about sharing slides from today. There's lots of great information in the slides that were presented. So we'll share that. We'll also ensure that some of the source questions are answered in that slide deck, since we don't have a time to get to those within the content of the session today. At this point, we're at 11:59. We're sensitive to your time and want to wrap up, but I want to start by saying, Lynn, Renjuan, John, thank you again for your time. Thanks for contributing in this meaningful way. Thank you also to our participants for joining us, for sharing your questions, and for sharing your time with us. Our next webinar is not yet scheduled, but we do look forward to having future webinars in this series. And you can also catch up on our past webinars. You can rewatch this one and reflect back on other webinars that we posted on our YouTube channel featuring all of the recordings. So thank you all again for your time. Thank you for being here today. And we look forward to having you join us again in the future. Have a great day, everyone.